Everyone at the county auction laughed the moment Helen Marrow raised her hand for the burned corn crib. Not a barn, not a house, not even land anyone with sense would fight for. Just a blackened, half-collapsed corn crib sitting at the edge of a dead field, one wall leaning like it was ready to give up, the roof split open, and the smell of old smoke still trapped in the wood. The auctioneer actually paused. For a second, he looked at the 72-year-old widow as if she was too confused to understand what she had just done. Then he smiled into the crowd. "Helen," he said, "you know this thing is worth less than the nails holding it up." That was all they needed. The laughter got louder. Her son stared down at his boots, too ashamed to look at her. A developer in a clean gray jacket folded his arms like the whole thing was already over. Someone near the back whispered that grief had finally taken what age had left behind. Helen did not defend herself. She only looked at the burned floorboards and said, "My husband told me not to let them tear it down." Nobody understood why, not until the first board came loose. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and things the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing. Because what happened in that burned corn crib was not just about an old widow, a ruined building, or a county auction. It was about the truth waiting underneath. The auction was held behind the Mason County Courthouse on a cold Saturday morning. Folding chairs sat crooked across the gravel. Behind a rope line, the county's unwanted things waited like they had already been judged. At the bottom of the list, printed small, sat the burned corn crib off County Road 6. Helen Marrow stood near the back, in a dark wool coat, stitched black gloves, brown church shoes, and a gray scarf over silver hair. People had been watching her since she arrived. In Mason County, widows were allowed to grieve with flowers, old jackets, and quiet church pews. They were not supposed to spend their savings on a burned-out corn crib everyone else had decided was worthless. Her son Daniel stood beside her, stiff with shame. He had driven in from Cedar Falls after a neighbor warned him what Helen planned to do. "Mom," he said under his breath, "we can still leave." Helen kept her eyes forward. "You don't need to do this." She did not answer. At the front, Warren Pike worked through the smaller lots. But even Warren knew there was no way to dress up the last item. He lifted the sheet with 2 fingers. "Last item," he said. "Old corn crib off County Road 6. Fire damage. Partial collapse. No utilities. Unsafe structure notice pending." People chuckled before he named the bid. Clayton Voss stood near the clerk's table, too clean for gravel, buying parcels along County Road 6 and calling it progress. Warren scanned the crowd. "We'll open at $50. No one moved. Warren grinned. "Come on now. Scrap wood has to be worth something to somebody." A man called, "Maybe sell it as firewood twice." The crowd laughed. Daniel shifted. "Please don't." Helen raised her hand. For a moment, Warren went silent. Then he leaned forward, squinting. "Helen Marrow, is that your bid?" "Yes," Helen said. The laughter started low, then spread. Warren tried to hide his smile and failed. "Helen, you know this thing is worth less than the nails holding it up." "I heard you," she said. Clayton turned slowly, looking from Helen to Daniel, then back again. 75, Clayton said. It was not a bid so much as a swat. Helen raised her hand again. 100. Daniel closed his eyes. Someone behind them whispered, "Thomas has only been gone 3 years. She still isn't right." Helen heard it. At 72, a woman learned that cruel people rarely lowered their voices enough. $100, Warren said. "For a structure the county might make you tear down next week." 125, Clayton said. 150, Helen said. Now the laughter changed. Less humor, more warning. People turned toward Daniel as if he had the right to stop his mother from embarrassing herself. Daniel touched her elbow. "Mom, enough." Helen gently moved her arm away. Clayton smiled, but not kindly. "Mrs. Marrow, I'd be happy to take that liability off your hands after the sale. No need for you to get tangled in county notices." Helen finally looked at him. "That floor is not yours," she said. The words were quiet, but they changed the air. Clayton's smile thinned. "The floor?" Helen looked past him toward the bare cottonwoods and the blackened corn crib. Its roof sagged like a tired shoulder. Fire had darkened one wall, but the lower frame still stood. Though no one else could see it, Helen could see the raised wooden floor. She could see Thomas beside it years before, one hand on the doorframe. She could hear him 3 weeks before he died, voice thin but stubborn. "If they ever sell the corn crib, don't let them take the floor." Warren cleared his throat. 150 going once. Clayton looked at the clerk, then the crowd. He did not bid again. To everyone watching, that proved he had common sense. 150 going twice. Daniel whispered, "Mom, what did Dad tell you?" Helen did not look at him. "Sold," Warren called. To Helen Marrow, for $150 and whatever headache comes with it. People laughed one last time, but Helen did not feel embarrassed. She felt the stillness that comes when a promise stops being memory and becomes work. After the papers were signed, Daniel followed her across the field edge. "You spent money you don't have on a burned building you can't use," he said. Helen walked through the dead grass. "I know what I bought." "No, Mom, you bought a problem." She stopped at the doorway. Up close, the corn crib looked worse. Charcoal streaked the frame. Rusted nails jutted from split boards. The air smelled of ash, damp wood, and old grain. Helen stepped onto the first floorboard. Daniel reached for her. "Don't go in there." But Helen had already lowered herself to one knee. Near the center, where fire had eaten through the top layer, a narrow seam ran between two boards, too straight to be damage, too deliberate to be age. Helen brushed away ash with her gloved fingers. Beneath the soot, something had been carved into the underside edge of the board. Not a word. Not yet, just 3 small marks. Helen stared until her breath caught. Behind her, Daniel stopped talking. For the first time that morning, nobody was laughing. Thomas Marrow had never been a man who explained pain while he was feeling it. For nearly 50 years of marriage, Helen had learned to read him in smaller ways. A long pause at the kitchen window, a coffee cup set down harder than usual, a hand resting too long on the back of a chair. Thomas believed a man should carry his troubles quietly, and most of the time, Helen let him. But the old corn crib always changed him. Long before the fire blackened its walls, Thomas never liked driving past it. The structure stood beyond County Road 6, narrow and raised, with slatted sides and a floor built high enough for air to move beneath it. To most people, it was just another abandoned farm building left behind by a family that had moved away. To Thomas, it was something else. He never said he was afraid of it. He never said he hated it. He simply went quiet whenever it came into view. Once, years earlier, Daniel had been home for Thanksgiving. He sat in the back of Thomas's pickup, looking out at the old crib as they passed. "Why doesn't somebody tear that thing down?" Daniel asked. "It's probably full of snakes." Thomas did not laugh. "Snakes aren't the worst thing that ever hid under wood," he said. Daniel thought his father was joking. Helen did not. She looked at Thomas, but his face had already closed. That was how the subject always ended. Then the cancer came. It took Thomas slowly at first, then all at once. His work shirts hung loose from his shoulders. His boots stayed by the door more often than they went into the mud. By the final spring, Helen had moved his chair into the bedroom at the back of the house because he liked sitting near the west window. From that window, through the bare trees, he could see the roofline of the corn crib. Some afternoons, he watched it for so long, Helen felt as if someone else were standing outside, waiting to be remembered. One evening, rain tapped softly against the glass. Thomas had been asleep for nearly an hour when his eyes opened. 43, he whispered. Helen leaned closer. "What did you say?" They didn't count them right. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. "Who, Tom?" He looked toward the window. People can disappear if nobody writes them down. Helen felt a chill move through her, though the room was warm. The doctor had warned her that medicine could loosen memory near the end. The dying sometimes spoke from places no one else could see. So, she touched his hand and said, "You need to rest." But Thomas gripped her wrist. "No, listen to me." She stopped moving. "If they ever sell the old corn crib," he said, "don't let them take the floor." "The floor? Promise me." Helen stared at him. "What is under there?" His face tightened. Not with fear exactly, with shame. But it was not the shame of something he had done. It looked older than that, as if he had inherited it from a man who had run out of courage. "My father knew," Thomas whispered. "He should have told sooner." Then the strength left his fingers. Helen asked him about it the next morning. Thomas only shook his head and said he was tired. Whether he truly forgot or simply could not bear to say more, Helen never knew. 3 weeks later, he was gone. After the funeral, Daniel stayed long enough to help with the practical things. He fixed the porch step, sorted through insurance papers, and carried 2 boxes of Thomas's clothes to the church donation room. He did it all carefully, with the nervous tenderness of a son who wanted to help but did not know how to sit inside his mother's silence. Helen let him take most of the clothes, but she kept Thomas's brown work coat on the hook by the back door. 2 months later, she reached into one pocket and found a folded scrap of feed store paper. At first, she thought it was an old receipt. Thomas had kept receipts for everything: fencing wire, seed corn, mower belts, pipe fittings, even things bought 20 years before. But this paper had no prices. Only 3 names: Mateo Ruiz, Caleb Freeman, Ansel Carter. Under them, Thomas had written one sentence in his careful block letters: "Not all debts are money." Helen sat at the kitchen table until the afternoon light moved off the floor. She did not call Daniel. She already knew what he would say. He would tell her his father had been sick. He would tell her grief made ordinary things look meaningful. He would tell her not to start chasing shadows that could not answer back. For a while, Helen tried to believe that. 3 years passed. The farm changed in small ways. Grass grew higher along the fence. Thomas's tools gathered dust in the shed. People at church stopped asking how Helen was doing and started saying she looked well, which was what people said when they wanted grief to become polite. But every time she drove past County Road 6, her hands tightened on the steering wheel. After the fire, the corn crib looked even worse. Part of the roof had split open. One wall leaned. The county called it unsafe. Clayton Voss called it an obstacle. In the Mason County Gazette, the auction notice called it salvage structure, no assessed value. Helen cut the notice from the paper with sewing scissors. Then she placed it beside Thomas's scrap of paper. For the first time in 3 years, she understood that his final request had not been about saving wood. It had not been about sentiment, or grief, or one old farm building standing in a dead field. It was about something underneath. On the morning of the auction, before Daniel arrived, Helen stood in the bedroom where Thomas had spent his final weeks. His chair still faced the west window. She took his wedding ring from the small dish on the dresser and closed it in her palm. "I don't know what you left me," she whispered, "but I'll look." Then, she put the 3 names in her purse, buttoned her coat, and drove to town. She was not going to the auction to buy a ruin. She was going to keep a promise. And once the first strange marks appeared beneath the ash, Helen knew the next step was no longer memory. It was the corn crib itself. By noon, most of Mason County had already decided what Helen Marrow had bought. A hazard. A joke. A blackened pile of old lumber with a roof that looked one hard wind away from surrender. The corn crib sat beyond the road like something the fire had chewed but not swallowed. One side had gone dark all the way up to the eaves. The roof sagged in the middle, leaving a broken mouth where rain had been falling through for months. Charred slats bowed outward. Rusted nails showed along the frame like old teeth. Weeds grew around the posts, dry and stiff, rattling whenever the wind moved through them. To the county, it was an unsafe structure. To Clayton Voss, it was an obstacle. To Warren Pike and half the auction crowd, it was proof that grief could make a sensible woman foolish. But Helen stood in the doorway and saw none of those things first. She saw Thomas, not as he had been at the end, thin and tired in the bedroom chair, but as he had been years earlier, standing beside that same corn crib one autumn afternoon with his cap in his hands. He had not entered it. He had not touched the door. He had only looked down at the raised wooden floor with an expression Helen had never been able to name. Now she thought she understood part of it. Not fear. Boredom. Daniel stood behind her, refusing to step inside. "Mom, this floor could give way," he said. Helen looked down. The boards were dark from smoke, but not all in the same way. Some were deeply charred along the edges. Others looked older, gray beneath the black, as if they had been replaced long before the fire. Near the center, ash had gathered in a shallow line running straighter than any crack should have run. Helen bent slowly, one hand on her knee. Daniel came forward at once. "Don't. I'm only looking. That's what worries me." She brushed the ash aside with her gloved fingers. Under the soot, the seam remained. 2 boards met there, but not like the rest. The nails along one side were newer than the nails around them. Not new exactly, but different. Their heads were flatter, their spacing too even. Thomas had built and repaired enough floors for Helen to know when boards had been laid in haste and when they had been placed with intention. These had been placed with intention. A truck door slammed outside. Helen looked up as Clayton Voss stepped through the weeds toward them. He had not changed clothes after the auction. His gray jacket still looked clean enough for a bank lobby. "Mrs. Marrow," he called, with the kind of politeness that carried warning inside it. "I hope you understand the county can still condemn this structure." Daniel turned. "We know that." Clayton glanced at him, then back at Helen. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but this building is dangerous. If someone gets hurt, there will be liability. If children wander in, there will be liability. If it collapses before removal, there will be cost." Helen stood slowly. "You sound very concerned for a man who wanted to buy it for $75, she said. Clayton's mouth tightened. "I wanted the parcel cleared. You wanted the floor gone." For the second time that day, the word made him pause. It was slight, but Helen saw it. Daniel saw it too. Clayton recovered quickly. "I want progress. That road is going to change whether people like it or not. Cold storage, distribution, jobs. This county needs to stop worshiping every rotten board left by men who are already dead." Helen looked past him at the field. Some dead men still tell the truth better than living ones, she said. Clayton gave a short laugh, but it did not reach his eyes. You have until the inspection notice is finalized, he said. After that, you may not be allowed inside at all. He left before Helen could answer. Daniel watched him walk back to his truck. Mom, did you hear that? This is exactly what I mean. You are going to get yourself tangled in legal trouble over a building Dad barely talked about. Helen reached into her purse and took out the folded scrap of feed store paper. Daniel stared at it. What is that? Something I found in your father's coat. She handed it to him. He read the 3 names once. Then again, Mateo Ruiz, Caleb Freeman, Ansel Carter. Not all debts are money. His face changed, but not enough to become belief. Mom, he said quietly. Dad was sick. Yes. He said things near the end. Yes. Daniel lowered the paper. That doesn't mean this place has answers. Helen turned back toward the floor. No, she said, but it means I have to ask. For the first time, Daniel had no quick reply. Helen stepped carefully deeper into the corn crib. The air smelled of ash and damp grain, but beneath it was something older. Dry cedar, rust, and earth. Light came through the broken roof in narrow strips, falling across the floorboards like pale fingers pointing. She followed the strange seam with her eyes. It did not run from wall to wall. It formed a rectangle, not large, maybe 3 feet by 4. Too neat to be fire damage, too centered to be an accident. Helen lowered herself again, slower this time. Her knees protested. Her breath came short. She ignored both. At the corner of the rectangle beneath a crust of blackened dust, something metal caught the light. Daniel stepped closer despite himself. What is it? He asked. Helen brushed harder. A small iron ring lay flat against the wood, nearly hidden in a groove cut into the board. Not an aisle, not a hinge, a pull ring. Helen placed 2 fingers beneath it and tried to lift. It did not move. The metal had rusted tight, sealed by years of damp and smoke. Daniel looked from the ring to his mother. For the first time since the auction, his voice lost its anger. Was that always there? Helen shook her head. I don't know. Outside, Clayton's truck started and rolled away down the gravel road. The sound faded behind the cottonwoods. Inside the corn crib, Helen kept her fingers on the iron ring. The building the town had called worthless had just asked its first question, and Helen knew she would need Thomas's old crowbar before it gave her an answer. The next morning, Helen returned to the corn crib with Thomas's old crowbar. It had hung in the shed for years, above the workbench where his jars of bent nails, washers, and fence staples still sat in careful rows. The handle was worn smooth where his hand had held it. A strip of black tape circled the middle, placed there after the metal had once cracked the skin of his palm during a winter repair. Helen stood beneath that crowbar for almost a full minute before taking it down. It felt heavier than she remembered. By the time she reached the corn crib, Daniel was already there. He had parked his truck near the cottonwoods and was standing outside the doorway with a flashlight, gloves, and the expression of a man trying not to start another argument. You shouldn't be doing this alone, he said. I'm not alone now. That isn't what I meant. Helen walked past him into the crib. The morning light made the damage look sharper. Every charred edge, every split board, every place where rain had darkened the old wood seemed to warn her back. But the iron ring was still there, flat against the floor, nearly hidden in its groove. Daniel crouched beside her. I oiled it, he admitted. Helen looked at him. He shrugged. Came out early. Figured if you were going to be stubborn, I might as well keep you from breaking your wrist. It was not an apology, but it was something. Helen slipped the end of Thomas's crowbar beneath the iron ring and pulled. Nothing moved. She pulled harder. The metal groaned, but the wood held tight. Daniel reached for the crowbar. Let me. No. Mom. This was your father's tool, and I'm his son. Helen looked at him then, and for a moment the fight went out of both of them. She handed him the crowbar. Daniel set his feet, braced one hand against the floor, and pulled. The ring lifted half an inch before snapping back with a sound that echoed through the crib. Dust fell from the rafters. Helen coughed. Daniel froze. Outside, a truck slowed on the road. 2 men leaned out the window. One of them raised a hand and called, Find the treasure yet, Helen? The other laughed as the truck rolled on. Daniel's jaw tightened. Helen said nothing. By noon, the joke had reached the diner. Warren Pike was telling it before the lunch crowd had finished ordering. By his version, Helen Marrow had bought the burned corn crib because Thomas's ghost had hidden a fortune under the floorboards. Someone asked if ghosts paid property tax. Someone else said maybe she would find a box of ashes and call it inheritance. Martha Bell, the town librarian, sat alone in the corner booth with a bowl of soup growing cold in front of her. She did not laugh. By 2 o'clock, a white county envelope had been taped to the corn crib doorframe. Daniel found it first. Unsafe structure inspection pending, he read. No unauthorized entry recommended until review. Helen wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove. Recommended is not forbidden. It means they're building a case. It means Clayton made a phone call. Daniel looked toward the road, where the dust from passing vehicles kept rising and settling. You can't prove that. No, Helen said, not yet. They worked another hour. The pull ring would not lift far enough to open whatever lay beneath it. So Daniel began checking the boards around the rectangular seam. Most were warped from heat and damp. Some split when he touched them. Others were fastened so tightly they seemed less like flooring than a lid. Helen moved slowly along the edge, brushing ash from nail heads. Then she stopped. One nail near the corner was wrapped with something dark. At first she thought it was a strip of burned husk or old twine, but when she worked it loose with her fingers, it came away soft and frayed. Cloth. Not much. A narrow piece, folded tight around the nail before it had been driven in. Daniel held the flashlight closer. What is that? Helen turned it over in her palm. The cloth had once been blue. Time had faded it almost gray, but one edge still showed color where the wood had protected it. A tiny knot held the strip closed. Daniel reached for it. Careful. Helen untied it slowly. Inside was nothing but dust. For a moment, Daniel exhaled like that proved something. Then Helen saw the underside of the board where the cloth had rested. A mark had been cut into the wood. Not the same 3 marks she had seen before. This one looked like 2 letters pressed together. Emi, Ehi. Helen's hand went still. Daniel saw her face before he saw the carving. What? She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded Thomas's scrap of feed store paper. Mateo Ruiz. The first name on the list. Daniel stared at the paper, then at the mark beneath the board. Outside, another car slowed, but neither of them looked up. For the first time, Daniel did not tell her it meant nothing. He only whispered, "That could be a coincidence." Helen nodded once. It could, but her voice had changed. Daniel heard it. So did she. The corn crib had not opened yet. The iron ring remained rusted tight. The rectangle in the floor still refused to give way. The county notice fluttered against the doorframe behind them like a warning. But Helen no longer felt as if she were chasing Thomas's final words through fog. She had a name. Not a full answer. Not proof enough to make the town stop laughing, but enough to take to someone who still knew how to read what Mason County had tried to forget. Helen folded the scrap of paper again and looked toward town. Your father used to say the library kept more truth than the courthouse, she said. Daniel looked at the carved letters one more time. Then he stood. I'll drive, he said. The Mason County Public Library sat 2 blocks from the courthouse, in a brick building that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and rain whenever the weather turned damp. Helen had not been inside since Thomas died. For years, she had checked out quilting books, garden guides, and large print mysteries from the front desk, while Thomas waited in the truck with the engine running. He never said he disliked the library. He simply never came inside. Now Helen wondered if that had been another kind of silence. Daniel held the door for her. The little bell above it rang once, sharp and bright in the quiet room. Martha Bell looked up from the circulation desk. She was nearly Helen's age, though she carried herself with the alert patience of someone who had spent half her life helping people find things they did not know how to ask for. Her gray hair was cut short. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. Beside her hand lay a stack of local history newsletters tied with string. Helen, Martha said, softening at once. I heard about the auction. I imagine everybody did. Martha's mouth tightened. Everybody hears the wrong parts first. Daniel shifted beside his mother. We need help identifying something. Helen opened her purse and placed 3 items on the desk. Thomas's scrap of feed store paper, the faded strip of blue cloth, a phone photograph Daniel had taken of the carved letters beneath the floorboard. Martha did not touch anything at first. She only leaned closer. "MR?" she said. Helen nodded. The first name on Thomas's paper is Mateo Ruiz. Martha looked up quickly. Where did you find the carving? Under the floor of the corn crib. The quiet around them seemed to deepen. For a moment, the only sound was the old clock ticking above the reference shelf. Martha took her glasses from the chain and put them on. Come with me. She led them past the public computers, past the children's section, and through a narrow door marked staff only. Behind it, a set of stairs led down to the basement archives. The air changed as they descended. It grew cooler, dustier, threaded with the dry smell of cardboard and time. Most of this should have gone to the county records office years ago, Martha said. But the county only keeps what it thinks matters. Daniel frowned. And the library keeps the rest? Martha switched on a fluorescent light. Sometimes the rest is where the truth hides. Metal shelves lined the basement walls. Boxes were labeled by year, family name, church group, farm association, school district, weather events, and subjects so specific they seemed almost accidental. Bridge repairs, seed co-ops, migrant camps, closed stores, unpaid taxes. Martha went to a lower shelf near the back. "I've seen the name Ruiz," she said. "Not often. But I remember it because a woman came in years ago asking about seasonal labor records." She left upset. Helen felt the name settle heavier in her chest. Martha pulled a box labeled Agricultural Labor Notes, 1,938, 1,956. Inside were folders tied with cotton string. The papers were brittle and uneven, some typed, some handwritten, some stained at the edges. Martha handled them with care. For several minutes, no one spoke. She checked one folder, then another. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, but Helen noticed he was no longer impatient. Finally, Martha stopped. "There," she whispered. She turned a page toward Helen. The paper was a payroll summary from 1,949, written in faded ink. The top line named Harlan Produce and Storage. Beneath it were columns: worker name, days logged, wage due, housing deduction, final balance. Halfway down the page, one name appeared: Mateo Ruiz. Helen reached for the table edge. Daniel leaned closer. That could still be a common name. Martha did not argue. She moved her finger to the far right column. Next to Mateo Ruiz's name, someone had written two letters: Emi, Ehi. The same letters carved beneath the corn crib floor. Daniel's face changed. Not into belief exactly, into the beginning of fear. Martha turned another page. Here's something else. The next sheet was not a formal payroll. It looked like a rough copy, maybe notes made before the final record was submitted. Several names had small cloth color marks written beside them: blue, red, green, white. Helen looked down at the faded strip of cloth on the table. "Blue," she said. Martha nodded slowly. If workers couldn't sign, or if names were repeated, some farms used cloth tags, chalk marks, initials, anything that helped track people during harvest. It wasn't official, it was practical. "Why would a cloth tag be nailed under a floorboard?" Daniel asked. No one answered right away, because the answer was too large to say without proof. Martha kept looking through the folder, her lips pressed together as she read. "There are gaps," she said, "several pages missing after the fall of 1,949. Payroll starts again in 1950, but a number of names disappear." Helen unfolded Thomas's paper again. "Mateo Ruiz, Caleb Freeman, Ansel Carter." "Martha," she said, "can you check the other two?" Martha did. Caleb Freeman appeared in a church relief list from the same year, marked as laborer, temporary housing. Ansel Carter appeared in a county medical note, listed as injured hand, harvest crew. Then both names vanished from later records. Not died, not moved, not paid, just gone. Daniel stepped back from the table. "My father knew this?" Helen looked at the three names. "Your father knew enough to be ashamed he didn't know more." Martha removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Helen," she said carefully, "if these initials under the floor match names in labor records, there may be more than one." "There are," Helen said. Martha looked at her. Helen told her about Thomas whispering 43. The basement seemed colder after that. Martha took the photograph of the carved MR and studied it again. "We need to document everything before anyone else touches that floor." Daniel looked toward the ceiling, toward the street above them, toward the courthouse 2 blocks away. "Clayton already has the county moving," he said. "Then we move faster," Martha said. Helen looked at the payroll sheet one more time. For 3 years, Thomas's final words had lived inside her like a question. Now, for the first time, one piece of that question had a name, a record, and 2 letters carved into wood. It was not enough to prove the whole truth, but it was enough to prove Thomas had not been rambling, enough to prove the corn crib had remembered someone the county had forgotten. Martha closed the folder, but kept one hand resting on it. "I'll come with you," she said. Daniel looked at his mother. This time, he did not ask if she was sure. Outside, clouds had moved over the town, and the courthouse clock began to strike the hour. Helen placed Thomas's paper back in her purse. The first name had answered. Now they had to find the other 42. By the time Helen, Daniel, and Martha returned to the corn crib, the wind had shifted. It came low across the dead field, carrying the smell of damp soil and old ash. The county notice still fluttered against the doorframe, its white paper too clean for the burned wood behind it. Someone had underlined the words "unsafe structure" in red marker. Daniel saw it first. "Clayton," he said. Helen did not answer. She stepped inside with Thomas's paper folded in her coat pocket and a small notebook Martha had given her in her hand. Martha followed with a camera, plastic evidence sleeves from the library archive, and a pencil sharpened down to half its length. She moved carefully, not like a woman entering a ruin, but like someone entering a room where the past might still be listening. "We document before we touch," Martha said. Daniel knelt by the rectangular seam and set Thomas's crowbar beside him. "Then we touch?" "Then we touch," Martha said. Helen stood near the center of the floor and looked down at the pull ring. Yesterday, it had seemed like a question. Now it looked like a mouth held shut. Martha photographed the ring, the seam, the MR carving, and the blue cloth tag. Daniel worked slowly around the edge, brushing ash from nails and checking which boards had been altered. The more he looked, the more his face changed. "These boards weren't repaired after a fire," he said. "They were fitted like a cover." Helen's breath caught. A cover for what? Daniel slid the crowbar beneath the first loosened board. The wood protested. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the board lifted with a dry cracking sound that made all three of them freeze. Dust rose from the gap, not smoke, not rot. Dust, sealed away for years. Daniel lifted the board enough for Martha to shine her flashlight beneath it. There was a hollow space under the floor. Not deep, maybe 18 inches, but it had been deliberately boxed in between the joists, protected from the weather by boards, tar paper, and old sheet metal. Helen lowered herself to her knees before Daniel could stop her. Inside the hollow lay a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth. Beside it sat a small tin box, rusted along the edges but still closed. No one spoke. The town had laughed because they imagined treasure. But what lay under the floor did not feel like treasure. It felt like testimony. Daniel reached in first and lifted the oilcloth bundle with both hands. It was lighter than he expected. Martha spread a clean cloth over one of the steadier boards, and he placed the bundle there carefully. Helen untied the string. Inside were folded papers, brittle but protected. Some were payroll sheets. Some were torn ledger pages. Some were scraps with names written in different hands. Between them were strips of colored cloth, each tied into a small knot. Blue, red, green, white, yellow. Martha put one hand over her mouth. "These are not random," she whispered. Daniel opened the tin box. Inside were more papers, 2 black and white photographs, and a small envelope so worn that the corners had gone soft. On the back of the envelope, someone had written one sentence. "For the ones they will not count." Helen closed her eyes. Thomas's voice returned to her, thin and urgent from that last spring. "People can disappear if nobody writes them down." Martha began reading names. Mateo Ruiz. Helen looked at Daniel. Caleb Freeman. Daniel looked down at Thomas's scrap. Ansel Carter. Martha's voice slowed. Lucia Mendez. Joseph Bell. Rosa Alvarez. Henry Shaw. Tomas Weaver. Isaac Green. Alma Ruiz. The list kept going. Some names had initials beside them. Some had wage amounts. Some had days worked. Some had marks that seemed to match the cloth colors. A few had the word unpaid written in the margin. Daniel sat back on his heels. "These were workers," he said. Martha nodded, still reading. "Harvest crew, most likely. Storage crew. Maybe families, too." Helen looked beneath the lifted board. The underside of the surrounding floor was covered in marks. Not one carving. Dozens. Initials cut small and careful near the joists. Some were nearly hidden by soot. Some had been protected by the overlap of wood. Some were paired with tiny notches, as if someone had tried to count without leaving anything obvious. Daniel moved to another board and lifted it. More initials. Another cloth strip. Another folded page. Martha began numbering the discoveries in her notebook. Her hand shook only once, when she reached the 23rd name. By the time they had opened the second section of the floor, the three of them understood. The corn crib had not been hiding one secret. It had been holding a record. A record someone had gone to great lengths to keep after the official version had erased it. Helen unfolded Thomas's scrap of paper and placed it beside the ledger pages. 3 names from her husband's coat. 40 more from beneath the floor. 43. Daniel whispered the number first. Helen did not cry. The feeling was too large for tears. It moved through her slowly, like cold water under a door. For 3 years, she had wondered whether Thomas's final words were memory breaking apart. Now the floor itself had answered him. Martha looked toward the doorway. "We need the sheriff." Daniel stiffened. "Do we? If this is evidence connected to missing county records, yes. But we call him before Clayton does." Daniel took out his phone. Sheriff Nolan Briggs arrived 20 minutes later. He came in with the cautious expression of a man expecting family drama and county paperwork. He removed his hat when he saw Helen kneeling beside the open floor. "What exactly am I looking at?" he asked. Martha handed him the first photographed sheet. Names that appear in old labor records, she said. And then disappear. Sheriff Briggs looked at the paper, then at the floor, then at the county notice on the doorframe. His expression hardened, but not at Helen. At the situation. Who else knows about this? Before anyone could answer, tires crunched outside. A gray truck stopped near the cottonwoods. Clayton Voss stepped out. He looked at the open floor, then at the tin box, then at the sheriff. For the first time since Helen had raised her hand at the auction, Clayton Voss did not look amused. He looked afraid. Clayton Voss stood at the doorway of the corn crib, staring at the open floor as if the thing he had called worthless had suddenly become dangerous. He did not step inside. Sheriff Nolan Briggs noticed that first. "You came fast," Briggs said. Clayton adjusted his cuffs. "The county informed me there was activity on an unsafe structure connected to a development corridor." Helen was kneeling beside the lifted boards, her gloves black with ash. Martha had the ledger pages spread on a clean cloth, photographing each item before moving it. Daniel stood close enough to his mother that nobody could reach the floor without passing him. Clayton looked at the papers. "Those documents need to be secured by proper authorities." Martha did not look up. "They are being documented. I mean removed." Sheriff Briggs folded his arms. "Not until we know what they are." Clayton smiled, but it was thin. "Sheriff, we both know old farm records can be misunderstood. Initials, wage notes, names, people start building stories, then reputations get damaged." Helen looked at him. "Whose reputations?" Clayton did not answer. That silence did more than any confession could have. By late afternoon, the pressure came from every direction. The county administrator called Briggs twice. A planning board member arrived with a folder and suggested the corn crib should be sealed, for safety. A lawyer representing the development company left a message warning Helen not to disturb materials that might affect a future property dispute. Martha listened to the phrase and shook her head. "Property dispute," she said. "That is what people call history when they want to own it." Daniel kept working. He photographed the floorboards, the initials, the cloth tags, the pages, the tin box, even the county notice taped to the frame. Then he sent copies to Helen, Martha, and himself. Helen saw him do it. "You believe me now?" she asked quietly. Daniel paused. "I believe Dad gave you a promise. I believe Granddad's name is closer to this than I want it to be. And I believe Clayton wants that floor closed before anyone understands why." It was not a simple apology. It was better. It was action. As Martha read deeper into the papers, the pattern sharpened. The names belonged to harvest crews from the fall of 1949. Some were marked with cloth colors. Some had wage amounts written beside them. Several had one word in the margin: unpaid. Then Martha found the business names: Harlan Produce and Storage, Pike Orchard, Voss Cold Rooms, Bellman Grain. Daniel read the third name aloud. Voss. Everyone looked toward Clayton. His face reddened. "My grandfather did business all over this county. That proves nothing." "No," Martha said, "but it explains why you were so eager to clear the site." Clayton stepped forward. Sheriff Briggs moved between him and the documents. "That is far enough," Briggs said. The air in the corn crib changed. Until that moment, Helen had been the widow who bought a ruined building. Now she was the owner of evidence tied to old money, old farms, and names Mason County still treated with respect. Outside, 2 trucks slowed along the road. People were coming to look. News had spread that something had been found, though no one yet knew what. Helen heard one woman whisper that maybe Thomas Marrow had hidden money. Another man said the county should take charge before Helen ruined something important. The word important struck her. Yesterday, the corn crib had been trash. Today, because it might accuse someone, it had become important. Clayton saw the gathering dust and lowered his voice. "Mrs. Marrow, you are standing in the middle of something bigger than you understand." Helen stood slowly, one hand on Daniel's arm. "No," she said. "I think I finally understand why men like you wanted me to feel small." The words struck harder than shouting. Daniel looked at her then, and something in his face broke open. Shame, yes, but also recognition. At the auction, he had worried about what people thought of his mother. Now he understood that public embarrassment had been the first tool used to push her away from the truth. For the first time, Daniel stepped fully in front of her. "My mother owns this corn crib," he said. "The sheriff is here. The documents are photographed. If the county wants to secure something, it can start by securing the truth." Helen looked at her son. At the auction, he had lowered his eyes. Now he did not. The planning board member opened his folder. "Sheriff, the county may have authority to restrict entry." Briggs looked at the open floor, the cloth tags, and the names written in fading ink. The county had 77 years, he said. It can wait one more night. No one spoke after that. Clayton's jaw tightened, but he backed away. Before leaving, he looked once more at the floor and said, "You have no idea what you are opening." Helen answered, "Then why are you so afraid of it?" Clayton got into his truck without replying. When the vehicles finally left, dusk had settled over the field. The corn crib looked darker than before, but not emptier. Something inside it had awakened. Daniel sat beside Helen on an overturned crate. His phone kept buzzing, but he ignored it. "I'm sorry," he said. Helen looked at him. "For what?" "For thinking this was only grief. For thinking people were laughing because you gave them a reason." Helen's eyes stayed on the boards. "They were laughing because they did not know what they were standing over," she said. Martha gathered the papers and removed one clipping from her folder. "I found this before we came back," she said. It was a newspaper article from October 1949. The headline read, "Harvest crews leave county after storage fire." The bottom half had been cut away. Helen touched the torn edge. Martha's voice dropped. "If we find the missing half, we may find out why 43 names were hidden under this floor." Helen looked at Daniel, then at the open boards. The next question was no longer whether Thomas had been right, it was who had made sure the truth stayed buried. They found the missing half of the article the next morning in the library basement. Not in the courthouse archive. Not in the county record room. Martha found it on a scratched roll of microfilm stored in a cabinet with a broken handle and no proper label. Daniel pried it open with a screwdriver while Helen stood behind them with Thomas's folded paper in her coat pocket. The machine flickered to life. Old headlines passed across the screen: church suppers, crop prices, school board notices, a barn dance canceled because of rain. Then the date appeared. The 14th of October 1949. Harvest crews leave county after storage fire. The top half matched Martha's clipping. It said several seasonal crews had departed Mason County after a fire-damaged part of Harlan produce and storage. It said wages were being reviewed. It blamed confusion on poor record-keeping. Then Martha scrolled lower. The missing paragraphs came into view. Workers had claimed unpaid wages. Families had said payroll records were destroyed. A county deputy had said there was no proof of intentional wrongdoing. Then came the sentence that made Daniel step back from the machine. Several workers alleged they were ordered off company property before payment could be completed. Helen gripped the back of a chair. Martha printed the page. "That is why someone cut it." "No," Helen said. "That is why someone saved it." They returned to the corn crib before noon. Sheriff Briggs had placed tape around the structure, not to keep Helen out, but to keep others from stepping in. He looked tired, as if the phone had not let him sleep. "County wants the papers transferred," he said. "2 lawyers want access. One man called to say his grandfather's name better not be mentioned in public." "Was it in the papers?" Daniel asked. Briggs looked toward the floor. "I am starting to think many grandfathers' names are in those papers." Inside, the tin box sat on a clean cloth. Helen had not opened the small envelope the day before. It had felt too final. Now she sat on an overturned crate, opened it carefully, and removed 4 folded pages. The handwriting was cramped and dark. "My name is Elias Marrow," the first page began. Daniel whispered, "Granddad." Helen read aloud. Elias Marrow had been 23 in 1949, working nights at Harlan Produce. He swept floors, carried crates, checked locks, and sometimes moved payroll slips between the storage office and the farms that used the facility. He wrote that he was not important enough to stop what happened and too afraid to say what he saw. The dispute began after the harvest crews demanded full payment. The season had been good. Storage rooms were full. Trucks moved late into the night, but the ledgers showed deductions the workers had never agreed to. Housing fees, tool fees, transport fees, spoiled produce fees, and debts carried from previous seasons. By the time some workers were paid, they were told they owed more than they had earned. Mateo Ruiz refused to sign. So did Caleb Freeman. So did Ansel Carter. Others stood with them. Then the fire happened. Elias wrote that it was not the great accidental blaze people later described. It was small, controlled, and convenient. It damaged the storage office where payroll copies were kept, but spared the rooms where produce was stored. Afterward, the companies said the records were gone. Without records, wages became a rumor. Complaints became confusion. The workers were told to leave. Some left because they had children and no money to fight. Some tried the church. Some went to the county. No one with power listened long enough. Daniel took the pages when Helen's voice faltered. Elias had kept copies he was supposed to burn. Payroll scraps, cloth tags, wage notes, names, not enough to fix everything. Enough to prove the workers had existed and had been owed. For 2 weeks, he hid them in a feed sack behind his house. Then a man came at night and warned him that young husbands should think carefully before making enemies of men who owned storage rooms, banks, and courthouse friendships. Elias had a wife, a baby, a small life that could be crushed. So he did not go to the sheriff. He did not go to the newspaper. He went to the corn crib. The Harlan corn crib was raised, dry underneath, and rarely entered after harvest. Elias lifted the boards, tucked the records inside, carved initials near the joists so he would remember where each cloth tag belonged, and sealed the bundle in oilcloth. Then he lived with the difference between saving proof and speaking truth. Helen closed her eyes. Now she understood Thomas's shame. His father had hidden the evidence. Thomas had inherited the burden, and Helen had inherited the last chance. Martha read the final page. If my son Thomas ever finds this, I pray he is braver than I was. If he is not, I pray someone after him will be. These names are not mine to keep. They belong to families who were told to leave with empty hands and no proof that anything had been taken from them. Below that were the 43 names. Some had wage amounts. Some had family notes. Some had only a name, because that was all Elias could save. At the bottom, he listed the businesses that used the disputed crews: Harlan Produce and Storage, Pike Orchard, Voss Cold Rooms, Bellman Grain. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat. That is not just history. That is evidence of what people chose to erase. That afternoon, Clayton returned alone. He looked less polished than before. His jacket was wrinkled. His voice was lower. My attorney believes there is a way to handle this privately, he said. A preservation review. A small marker. Compensation, perhaps. No public accusations until every family has been protected. Daniel looked at him. Which families? The ones who were not paid, or the ones who did not pay them? Clayton's mouth tightened. Helen sat beside the open floor with Elias's letter in her lap. I am trying to keep this town from tearing itself apart, Clayton said. No, Helen said. You are trying to keep people from asking why it stayed whole by forgetting them. Clayton looked at the list. What do you want? Helen thought of Thomas in the bedroom, fighting to give her a warning before his voice left him. She thought of Elias, too frightened to speak but not empty enough to burn the proof. She thought of the workers who had been told to leave with no wages and no record strong enough to defend them. Then she looked at the envelope. For the ones they will not count. I want them counted, she said. Clayton stared at her. All 43, Helen said. Out loud. Here. Martha closed her notebook. Daniel stood beside his mother. Sheriff Briggs nodded once. And for the first time since the autumn of 1949, the decision no longer belonged to the families who had buried the story. It belonged to the woman who had bought the floor. By sunset, Martha was already making calls. Daniel was preparing copies, and Sheriff Briggs was arranging to keep the corn crib protected through the night. The next step would not be private. It would be a public reading. By noon the next day, people began gathering along County Road 6. No one had sent invitations. Martha had called the local paper, the church office, and 3 families whose names appeared in old labor notes. Daniel had posted a short message online with photographs of the floorboards, the initials, and the sentence written on Helen Marrow's envelope. For the ones they will not count. By morning, the whole county knew Helen Marrow was going to read the names at the burned corn crib. Some came because they were curious. Some came because they were ashamed. Some came because they were afraid their family name would be spoken in a way they could not control. Sheriff Briggs parked his cruiser near the entrance and kept the road clear. He did not put on a show of authority. He simply stood where everyone could see him, hat low, hands folded, making sure no one stepped past the tape or touched the open floor. Martha set a small table outside the corn crib. On it, she placed copies of the ledger pages, the printed newspaper article, and Helen Marrow's letter sealed inside a clear protective sleeve. Helen stood beside the doorway. She wore the same dark wool coat from the auction, but people looked at her differently now. 2 days earlier, she had been the widow who spent money foolishly. Now she was the woman who had bought back a piece of truth for $150. Daniel stood beside her, holding the list. He had asked to read with her. Helen had said yes. Warren Pike arrived late and stayed near the back. He did not make jokes. He did not call attention to himself. He only removed his straw hat and held it against his chest. When Helen saw him, he looked down. Clayton Voss came too, but he remained by his truck. His attorney was not with him. That mattered. Martha stepped forward first. These names were found beneath the floor of this corn crib, she said. They appear in private records, payroll scraps, cloth tags, and notes preserved by Helen Marrow after the storage fire of 1949. Some of these people may still have descendants. Some may not. But today, their names will not stay under the floor. The crowd was still. Helen took the paper from Daniel. Her hands trembled once, then steadied. Mateo Ruiz, she read. A woman near the road made a sound as if the name had struck her in the chest. Helen looked up. The woman was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back and one hand pressed over her mouth. Beside her stood a teenage boy wearing a school jacket. Martha walked toward her gently. "Are you family?" The woman nodded. "My grandmother's father," she said. "We were told he left Iowa and never sent money home. My grandmother said her mother waited for wages that never came." Helen lowered the paper. "What is your name?" "Elena Ruiz." For a moment, no one moved. Then Helen stepped down from the doorway and held the list out to her. Elena did not take it at first. She looked at the burned corn crib, the open floor, the table of papers, and the crowd of people who had lived for decades in a town that never told her family the truth. "My grandmother died thinking he abandoned them," Elena said. No one answered. There was no answer large enough. Finally, Daniel spoke. "He didn't disappear," he said. "They erased the record." Elena took the list with both hands and stared at the name. Mateo Ruiz. Not rumor. Not shame. A name written down. Helen touched her arm. "Would you like to read the next one?" Elena swallowed and nodded. Together they read, Mateo Ruiz, Caleb Freeman, Ansel Carter, Lucia Mendez, Joseph Bell, Rosa Alvarez, Henry Schaff, Tomas Weaver, Isaac Green, Alma Ruiz. The names continued into the cold afternoon. Some people cried quietly. Some stared at the ground. Some looked toward family members as if old stories were shifting under their feet. When the final name was read, nobody clapped. Applause would have been too easy. Instead, the crowd stood in a silence that felt like the first honest thing Mason County had given those 43 people. Then Warren Pike stepped forward. His face was red, but not from laughter this time. "Helen," he said, voice rough, "I made a fool of myself at that auction." Helen looked at him. "No," she said. "You made a fool of me." Warren lowered his head. "Yes, ma'am, I did." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "The auction commission," he said. "I don't want it. Put it toward preserving this place." That broke something open. Not loudly. Slowly. A woman from church offered to organize meals for volunteers. A retired carpenter said the corn crib could be braced without destroying the floor. Martha said the library would create a public archive. Sheriff Briggs announced that copies of the documents would be sent to the state historical office before anyone in the county could misplace them. Even Clayton Voss stepped forward before the crowd left. He did not apologize fully. Not yet. But he looked at Elena Ruiz and said, "My family benefited from records that were not kept honestly. I can't undo that. But the development company will not touch this structure." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Don't protect your family name," she said. "Protect theirs." Clayton nodded once. Daniel turned to Helen after the crowd began to thin. "I should have stood with you sooner," he said. Helen looked at the open floor. "You're standing now." He took her hand. Behind them, Martha began placing each copied page into a folder marked Corn Crib Names Project. The phrase looked small on paper, but Helen knew better now. The burned corn crib was no longer a joke, no longer a hazard, no longer a piece of scrap waiting for demolition. It had become a place people would have to return to, not to laugh, to remember, and that meant the work was not finished. It was only becoming a legacy. By spring, the burned corn crib no longer looked abandoned. It still looked old. Helen insisted on that. She did not want it painted bright white or rebuilt into something pretty enough for brochures. She did not want polished boards replacing every scar. She did not want the fire hidden, or the smoke marks sanded away until the place looked innocent. "This building is allowed to look like what it survived," she told the preservation committee. So they braced the leaning wall instead of removing it. They sealed the roof where rain came through, but left one charred beam visible beneath the new support. They built a narrow walkway so visitors could step inside without touching the original floor. And beneath a simple glass panel, they preserved the section where the first initials had been found. M.E.E. 2 letters that had started everything. At first, some people complained. They said the memorial would embarrass the county. They said it would reopen old wounds. They said the past should be handled carefully, which often meant quietly. But the names had already been spoken. Once a name entered the air, it was harder to bury again. Martha Bell created the archive in the public library. She labeled it carefully. The Corn Crib Names Project, Mason County, 1949. Copies of Elias Marrow's letter were placed beside payroll sheets, cloth tags, photographs, and the full newspaper article that had once been cut in half. Sheriff Briggs sent the documents to the state historical office, just as he promised. He also made sure copies stayed with the families who came forward. More descendants arrived over the next months. Some drove from nearby counties. Some came from other states. Some came with only a family rumor and left with a name. Elena Ruiz came back 3 times. The first time, she brought her son. The second time, she brought a photograph of her grandmother as a young woman. The third time, she brought a small framed note written in Spanish, explaining that Mateo Ruiz had not abandoned his family. He had worked, he had stood up for his pay, and his name had waited under a floor until someone finally read it. Helen watched Elena place the note near the glass panel. "I wish your grandmother could have known," Helen said. Elena nodded. "Me too." Then she looked at Helen. "But my son knows. That matters." It did. Helen thought about that often. For years after Thomas died, she had believed grief was something that only took away. It took voice, routine, sleep, appetite, the easy shape of ordinary days. But now she understood that grief could also carry instructions. A final sentence. A name in a coat pocket. A promise no one else understood. Daniel changed too. He came by more often, not because he feared his mother was slipping, but because he finally understood she had been holding steady when everyone else thought she was breaking. On Saturdays, he repaired the porch. On Sundays, he drove her to the corn crib after church. Neither of them talked much on those drives. They did not need to. One afternoon in May, they found Warren Pike standing alone inside the walkway, hat in his hands, looking at the preserved floorboards. He had not known anyone was behind him. "I keep thinking about that morning," Warren said without turning. "How easy it was to make people laugh." Helen stood beside him. "It usually is," she said. Warren nodded, ashamed. "Harder to make things right." "Yes." He looked at the names behind the glass. "I'm still helping with the fund." "I know." After the public reading, the town had created a small restoration fund. Not large, not dramatic, but steady. Families donated what they could. The Voss Development Company contributed too, though Clayton never gave a speech about it. That was for the best. Some apologies were more honest, when they did not ask for applause. The fund paid for the memorial plaque. It stood just outside the doorway, made of plain bronze, mounted low enough for children to read. 43 names. No grand language. No heroic phrasing. Just names, dates where they were known, and one sentence chosen by Helen from Elias Marrow's letter: "These names are not mine to keep." The dedication ceremony was held on a clear Sunday afternoon. People gathered in the grass where weeds had once grown waist-high. Martha spoke briefly. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat. Elena Ruiz stood near the front with her son. Daniel stood beside Helen, one hand lightly under her elbow, though she did not need help standing. When it was Helen's turn, she looked at the crowd for a long time. She saw people who had laughed, people who had doubted, people who had feared what the floor might say, and people who had come because someone in their family had once disappeared from the record, and now, at last, had a place to be remembered. Helen unfolded no speech. She only said, "My husband asked me not to let them take the floor. I thought I was keeping a promise to him, but I understand now. He was keeping one to them." Then she stepped back. That was enough. Later, when the crowd thinned, Daniel walked her inside the corn crib. Sunlight passed through the repaired slats in narrow golden lines. Dust floated in the air, soft and harmless now. The place still smelled faintly of old smoke, but also of fresh cedar, turned earth, and spring grass. A group of school children stood near the plaque with their teacher. One child read the first name carefully, Mateo Ruiz. Another read the next, Caleb Freeman. Then another, Ansel Carter. Helen closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost feel Thomas beside her. Not sick, not burdened, just quiet, the way he had always been when something mattered too much for easy words. Daniel touched the glass above the preserved initials. "Dad was right," he said. Helen opened her eyes. "Yes," she said. "But so was your grandfather, in the only way he knew how to be." Outside, the children kept reading, name after name. Onebi one. The corn crib had been called worthless once. Helen never corrected them then. She only bought it, and kept the floor long enough for the truth to rise through the wood.